So, obviously when you have a difficult conversation with someone about anything, whether it's a clinical situation or not, you hope that the person you're speaking to is going to be receptive, but that's not always the case. And that's definitely true with firearms. What do you do in situations when the person you're speaking with about, say, firearm storage just isn't at all open to the conversation?
Yeah. So I think an important thing is to be really validating. And even if you don't agree with that person's perspective, you still want to validate them and make sure they understand that you hear them and that you're listening to them and getting where they're coming from. Because something that Mike really taught us through this was that we want to plant seeds for the future, even if we're not seeing change in that moment. So some conversations you have might not result in someone wanting to change. But if you're really validating in that moment and they really feel heard, then down the line, when they reflect back on that conversation, hopefully they remember it as a positive one. And that can kind of lead to, changes later on down the road after they reflect back and think about it. Because in the moment, they might be really put off by it. Sometimes it can really catch people off guard. And so they can really put up a wall. And so being very validating and understanding so that if they do think about it in the future, you've really planted the seeds that can grow into something instead of doing this thing that when they look back on it, they're like, oh my gosh, that person did not understand me. I'm never going to do what that person said, because they have no idea what they're talking about.
Yeah, and I think being open and validating too is really helpful in terms of sometimes discussing like a suicide safety plan with them. So our goal was to kind of think about general firearm storage changes that they could make, but sometimes though they weren't open to that, and so then we could say, well, could we talk about what you would do if you or a loved one were to become suicidal? Like, what would your steps be? I think the most of the time people are pretty open to it. And would say, like during the fall, that was still their plan, or that if they did have to enact their plan, they talked about it. And I think it was helpful to just be open and understanding and supportive of their reasons for why they store their firearms, and not push it to kind of get to that next step.
Yeah, that all makes a ton of sense to me. And I think one thing worth reflecting on is that when the three of us think about these conversations, we're thinking about it with folks who generally aren't acutely suicidal at that moment. And so there's a reason they might not be receptive to the conversation, because it feels very almost irrelevant to them and very far off. And so the notion of changing something now or planning for something that seems unrealistic feels like a little bit of a heavy lift. And that's why we think about, harvesting that plant later on, not as opposed to planting a seed right now. Obviously, if someone's suicidal in the moment, you're not talking about planting seeds for the future. But I think the three of us would argue that we shouldn't wait until that moment to be having this conversation. So you have that leeway for someone to reflect on this conversation they had that didn't end up being a fight.